So today we're going to get started talking about how electroacoustic music in the 20th century actually came about. We're going to start with the people who first started theorizing and making music with sound. And the two main groups we're going to talk about today are called the Futurists and the Dadaists. And we'll start with a quote from the reading for today from Luigi Russolo's 1913 essay, The Art of Noises. Away, let us break out, since we cannot much longer restrain our desire to create finally a new musical reality with a generous distribution of resonant slaps in the face. Discarding violins, pianos, double basses, and plaintive organs, let us break out. So Luigi wrote that in 1913, almost 100 years ago. And what he's calling for is pretty revolutionary. Clearly, in this short excerpt, he calls for discarding violins, pianos, double basses, and organs. So he's calling for a break from the musical past. From Italy, a country with a great musical culture, as you know, doesn't need to be repeated here. It's an incendiary thing to say, let's ditch all of that. So the question we're going to answer today is, what exactly was Luigi Russolo calling for? Who were the Futurists? And how did they turn these words into art? And the final question, of course, is how did this affect 20th century electronic music? Which, of course, we're going to see throughout the course of this quarter, but we're going to start with today. So the story of the Futurists starts with a man named F.T. Marinetti. Marinetti was born in 1876 in Alexandria, Egypt. He was the son of a merchant. In the late 1800s, the Suez Canal was just opened up for commerce. So businessmen were flocking to the area to take advantage of the new trade routes that were opening up and the new opportunities for commerce. Marinetti's father was one of these men, and while he was in Egypt, he was able to amass a great fortune, which, after Marinetti's older brother died, was eventually passed on to F.T. Marinetti and eventually bankrolled this group that we're going to talk about. Marinetti took up writing in his teens, and in 1894 he began studying law at university. As he progressed, it became clear that he was more interested in writing than in the law. In 1898, Marinetti published his first poem, and shortly afterward he won an award, and after he won this award, that took him to Paris, where he became kind of the talk of the town. He published in all the major literary magazines, and he kind of became a minor celebrity. He had a little writing career going on here. In 1901, he published his first book, The Conquest of the Stars. The book was an allegorical epic about masculinity overcoming femininity. So Marinetti was a giant sexist. This is something we're going to see over and over again throughout his career. He's a very polarizing figure. He both pushed the boundaries on the kind of social, what was socially accepted, and he had some opinions that were very inflammatory. This would be exemplified by his long friendship with, Benito Mussolini, but we're not going to get into that too much today. But this book was unique, and it exemplified Marinetti's writing style. In this book, the language was really pushed to the limit, and he was kind of being deliberately ridiculous. And it was very confusing. His works were very confusing to the literate academics at the time, and they're very confusing to us today. Yes, the guy was an overt sexist. Yes, he wrote this giant book about masculinity overcoming femininity. But what was he really saying? It's very confusing. I'm not a literature expert, so I'm not going to break it down here, but I just want to try to give you a feel for his writing style. In Marinetti's next two collections of poetry, he began using the imagery that would distinguish his artistic leadership as a whole. In Destruction and The Carnal City, Marinetti deals with the experience of the modern city and new technology. He treats the city/technology as something that is both alluring and simultaneously horrible. Almost all of Marinetti's works steer toward the violent and the macabre, and at this point in his career, he was something of a celebrity. Marinetti was obsessed with making a splash. That was his thing. He was kind of the P.T. Barnum of music at the time, or really the P.T. Barnum of all the arts at the time. He did whatever it took to get publicity for his work and the works of the people who he collaborated with. So one of the ways he did this was by pushing the boundaries of what was socially acceptable in his writing and in all of his art. So again, blending beautiful images, images of beautiful young women with images of death, etc., or, erotically describing a piece of machinery, for instance. These were hallmarks of his style and very unusual things, as we're going to see. But Marinetti was informed by the time at which he lived. He was a smart guy, and he picked up on the undercurrents in society and in art that were going on at the time. So we want to talk a little bit about when Marinetti lived, when the Futurists and the Dadaists were working, why they took up these new ideas in their art, why they even had the opportunity to take up these new ideas in their art. So, this group of people, including Marinetti, were living and working at the tail end of a period known as the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution is commonly dated from about 1860 until World War I, which is 1914. As it says on the slide, this period saw rapid changes in the way people lived their lives. And we see lots of technological changes today. I've got, my cell phone on me, my car keys on me, I've got this wireless microphone. I've got a million pieces of technology just on stage with me, but these aren't life-altering technologies, okay? In the cell phone, you could argue that the internet is life-changing, but a lot of the technological advance that we're used to today is a matter of a new consumer product, a better iPod to replace your old iPod, a faster laptop to replace your old laptop, etc., etc. But the changes they were seeing at the time of the Second Industrial Revolution were massive. These were changes not just for the wealthy or the super rich or for one portion of the populace, but for everybody. The entire way people lived their lives was changing at this period. And if we had any history majors, maybe they could tell you a little bit more about this. The main thing I'm going to focus on is the inventions that they saw at this time. These inventions really changed people's lives. Railroads, they were invented before 1860, obviously, but they were massively expanded at the time, and the same thing is true of telegraph. And also photography, electricity, and radio. All of these things really made the world smaller. Suddenly, your common person could afford to travel, which is, this is the first time in history that this is really true. The common person can afford to travel around the world. With telegraph, we have instantaneous communication. With photography, we can suddenly see things that were never possible to see before. And of course, at the tail end of the Second Industrial Revolution, electricity brings us light, and radio brings us entertainment and even faster communication. So people's lives are changing. Suddenly the middle class, or at least what you can call a working class, the wage earners, they have access to information and ideas from all over the world in a way that they never had before. In a way, you could draw the comparison to the internet. I guess a lot of us were children when the internet was invented, or at least when it was popularized. But that was a real mind-expanding thing. It really made the world smaller. Suddenly, communities that were very tiny and spread thinly out over the world had a place to aggregate on the internet. And a similar thing happened at this period. Suddenly, your distant third cousins, you could go visit them in France or wherever they lived because you could take a train there. So, Second Industrial Revolution, this witnesses the great industrialization and the great monopolies are born. For the first time, we can start talking about economies of scale, which I know nothing about, other than that they're big. The crowning achievement of the Second Industrial Revolution was the automobile. This is probably the invention that affected people's lives most. And you probably all realize this already, but the reason I'm focusing on it is because it profoundly affected Marinetti in a number of ways. Not only was Marinetti in a car accident that he claimed changed his life, but the sound of the city fundamentally changed at this point. Before there was the automobile, before there were these machines, cities were quiet. All we had were the sound of horses, the sound maybe of one or two factories in the city at this time, but at the Second Industrial Revolution, factories overtake the cities. Automobiles overtake the cities. What was relatively quiet in the past is now this loud soundscape. Okay, so for the first time in the world, for the first time in the history of the world, people are hearing and experiencing this modern city soundscape that today we just take for granted, and that even out in the country you can hear. So this would have a profound influence on many artists, and Marinetti was keenly aware of the power and the appeal of the modern city. So in 1908, Marinetti flipped his car into a ditch. Nobody was injured in the accident, but Marinetti, who knows whether this was publicity or whether this was truth, but he blew this into a mythical event. He flipped his car, and he was going to say that changed his life, because, I don't know, maybe he could get attention. So shortly after he flipped his car, he began working on the founding and manifesto of Futurism. And what he does here is amazing and should really reveal something about his character, because after he writes this manifesto about Futurism, he takes a train to Paris, where he looks up one of his father's old cronies, one of his father's old business pals, and he essentially calls in a favor on this guy. This guy, turns out, owns a lot of shares in the biggest newspaper in Paris at the time, which is called Le Figaro. I think it's the biggest newspaper in France. It might be one of the biggest in all of Europe. I'm not exactly sure. But he calls in this favor, and he managed to get his tract, The Founding and Manifesto of Futurism, published on the front page of Paris's largest daily newspaper. So, as we're going to see, The Founding Manifesto of Futurism is this wild artistic rant, okay? It is this out there, flamboyant, challenging, incendiary rant about art at the time. And he gets this published on the front page of the largest paper in the country. Okay? Can you imagine that? I mean, today, it's hard to imagine something this out there and wild and not really socially acceptable being published on the front page of something like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or I don't know, the news blogs, Huffington Post, or whatever news blog you happen to read. It's unbelievable. This wouldn't happen today. It's hard to imagine this happening, and this just shows how dedicated he was to publicizing himself and his friends. So what did it say in this manifesto? The manifesto starts with a mostly fictional narrative about Marinetti flipping his car. It employs the same dark imagery as Marinetti's other works, describing machines as beautiful living things and humans as inferior creations. So we're going to read a little bit of this. You'll see that it echoes the style seen in some of Luigi Russolo's Art of Noises, which is on e-comments, and you guys should have read for today, but we're going to go over it right. So let's look at what he says in an excerpt from the Founding Manifesto of Futurism. I stopped short and, to my disgust, rolled over into a ditch with my wheels in the air. Oh, maternal ditch, nearly full of muddy water, fair factory drain. I gulped down your bracing slime, which reminded me of the sacred black breast of my Sudanese nurse. When I climbed out, a filthy, stinking rag, from underneath the capsized car, I felt my heart deliciously being slashed with the red-hot iron of joy. A crowd of fishermen armed with hooks and naturalists stricken with gout formed the thronging circle around the prodigy. With patient and meticulous attention, they rigged up a derrick and enormous iron grapnels to fish out my car, stranded like a large shark. The car slowly emerged from the ditch, leaving behind in the depths its heavy chassis of good sense and its soft upholstery of comfort like scales. They thought it was dead, my beautiful shark, but one caress from me was enough to revive it, and there it was again, once more alive, running on its powerful fins. And so, our faces covered with good factory slime, a mix of metallic scum, useless sweat, heavenly soot, our arms bruised and bandaged, we, still fearless, have dictated our first intentions to all the living men of the earth. So after that, he would go on to his intentions and his pronouncements about what he thinks art should be. But we can see in this short excerpt another little bit of Marinetti's personality. We can see what he was doing to publicize himself in his own work. We can see the sort of language that he used to gain notoriety for first his writing and later his music. Marinetti really, he's not necessarily one of the great artists of the 20th century. I mean, his writing is certainly great, and probably in literature and even theater, he's probably more well-known than music. But really what Marinetti is one of the great personalities of 20th century music. And part of this is illustrated here. One of the things he said, this is an anecdote that I left out of the lecture, but he was talking later in his life to a young artist who had come to Paris to make his fortune. That's what you did then, went to Paris to make your fortune. So he was talking to a young artist who came to Paris to make his fortune, and he said to this young artist, he said, if you want to be a great artist, if you want to have all of Europe at your heels, all you need to do is confuse them. Work as hard as you can to confuse them, and that'll make you a popular and great artist. So you can see he does this with this essay. He says some things in this short essay, The Founding Manifesto of Futurism, that are totally confounding and confusing. You have a hard time understanding exactly what he's trying to say. First of all, he constantly describes his car, partly as a shark, but always as a living thing, always as almost a creation of God, which he has an intimate relationship with. And then he describes himself as this sort of inferior thing, as if he's saying, there's me, I'm made of this meat bag, and my car is superior because it's made of good metal, solid factory soot. So yeah, let's look at these images. Maternal ditch. This maternal ditch is full of factory drain, which he gulps down, this factory runoff, and it reminds him of his nursemaid. So he's saying, this factory runoff, it nurses me. When he climbs out, he is a filthy, stinking rag, but his heart is slashed with a red-hot iron of joy. I've never thought of a red-hot iron as something joyous. When I think of a red-hot iron, I think of getting branded. I think of pain. I do not think of joy. So you might roll right by that image, but it's very striking there if you look at it. A red-hot iron of joy. Okay. So then how does he describe his car coming out of this ditch? He describes it as if it's a surgery, with patient and meticulous attention. They rigged up the derrick, they pulled it out, and then it becomes this shark hanging from its chain over the ditch. The shark slowly emerged from the ditch, leaving behind in the depths its heavy chassis of good sense, whatever that is, and its soft upholstery of comfort like scales. They thought it was dead. They thought his car was dead. Apparently he didn't think that. But one crush from him was enough to revive it, and it was once more alive. And then, of course, the final image that I like in this is the stuff that he's covered with. His face is covered with good factory slime. I've never thought of factory slime as good, but maybe he does. A mix of metallic scum, useless sweat is pointless and useless, that comes from humans, and heavenly soot. Soot comes from machines, comes from industry. He loves it. So, I guess I don't really need to repeat it. This is strange imagery, and it's hard to be clear on exactly what he's trying to say here. But over the course of his career, he would bang this into the heads of his followers, or anybody who cared to listen. He thought machines were the greatest thing to happen to man. He thought technology was the thing. And he thought humans were inferior, and, forget them all as far as he was concerned. Then the manifesto breaks into a series of pronouncements that vaguely detail an aesthetic, artistic agenda. So let's look. This is his first manifesto. Let's look at what he says. Up until now, literature has exalted contemplative stillness, ecstasy, and sleep. We intend to exalt movement and aggression, feverish insomnia, the racer's stride, the mortal leap, the slap, and the punch. We intend to hymn man at the steering wheel, the ideal axis of which intersects the earth, itself hurled ahead on its own race along the path of its orbit. There is no beauty that does not consist of struggle. No work that lacks an aggressive character can be considered a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent assault launched against unknown forces to reduce them to submission under man. We intend to glorify war, the only hygiene of the world. We intend to glorify war, the only hygiene of the world. Again, humans, he's saying here, are dirt. And when there's a war that kills lots of them, this is hygienic. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of anarchists, beautiful ideas worthy of dying for, and contempt for woman. I guess he feels he has to tack that on there for some reason. I don't know why. We intend to destroy museums, libraries, academies of every sort, and to fight against moralism, feminism, and every utilitarian or opportunistic cowardice. Museums, cemeteries, identical really in the horrible promiscuity of so many bodies scarcely known to one another. Museums, public dormitories in which someone is put to sleep forever alongside others he hated or didn't know. Museums, absurd slaughterhouses for painters and sculptors who go on thrashing each other with blows of line and color along the disputed walls. So this is radical stuff, again, coming from Italy. Italy has a rich cultural heritage in all the arts, and he here is saying, screw all that, we have to do something new. And he's being very offensive in doing it, which hardly needs to be said. He's going to be offensive over and over throughout this lecture. So. From 1908 until the First World War, Futurism would expand and encompass artists from many backgrounds and disciplines. In 1910, Marinetti met three painters who enthusiastically joined the Futurist movement. These were Umberto Boccioni, Carlo Carrà, and Luigi Russolo. The group immediately published two manifestos on Futurist painting. These manifestos expanded the technology-focused aesthetic from literature into the visual arts. The painters wanted to shift focus away from human subjects. So you can see Marinetti's influence in all of this. His aesthetic ideal is leading through this. We want to shift away from focus on humanity and focus on other things. We declare, for instance, that a portrait, in order to be a work of art, must not resemble the sitter, and that the painter carries in himself the landscapes which he would fix upon his canvas. To paint a human figure, you must not paint it. You must render its surrounding atmosphere. Okay, so that's probably pretty offensive to anybody who paints likenesses for a living. I think he's offended everybody at this point, which is great. Again, that comes back to the idea that he was the P.T. Barnum of art. You know, no publicity is bad publicity to him. The manifestos publicized the group and kept them in the spotlight between shows. 1910 also saw Futurism's rise in the theaters. Through variety theater, Futurists created performance art with abstract free-form theater pieces that presaged the happenings of the 1960s and 1970s. We'll talk about those more later, I'm sure. It's important to remember that the Futurists were not musicians. They were almost entirely trained as writers and painters, with the exception of Balila Pratella, who studied with the Italian opera master Mascagni. So this is the most productive period for the Futurists. This period from about 1910 until 1914. Marinetti wrote the first essay in 1908, but then the Futurists didn't really take off until 1910. And unfortunately, everything was disrupted by the First World War. And this story is really tragic. The Futurists' involvement with both world wars, which Marinetti, of course, gets them tangled in, is just a really tragic story. Okay, but before we get to that, the Futurists are really productive as a group, and they do some amazing things. They have some amazing thoughts about art, which are just very forward-thinking, as we're going to see when we get to Luigi Russolo. But one other offensive and interesting thing about them is that they didn't just believe in what they said, they were willing to literally beat it into the people who disagreed with them. Okay? So when they went and they gave their speeches and distributed their leaflets and talked about their art, they would physically get in brawls with people who disagreed with them. Marinetti would go out into the audience and start beating people with his fists and his cane, okay? So let's read this. This is a little excerpt from an essay I have in the bibliography section, which I'll post to e-comments. In July, this is July of 1911 or 12. In July, Marinetti went to a small group of Futurists in Venice. They climbed the top of the clock tower that overlooks the Piazza San Marco. Has anybody here been to the Piazza San Marco? Anybody? A few of you? The Piazza San Marco is the main square in Venice. There's the giant Basilica San Marco in the background, and then towering above that is this medieval tower. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, people built towers to show they were powerful and important. And the tower in the Piazza San Marco, that was built by the governing council of Venice, and it's one of the biggest towers in the town. So this is a massive medieval tower built in the 11th century. It's a huge landmark of the city. They climb up it,
And they proceed to hurl thousands of leaflets down on the city's residents, damning the city as a market for counterfeiting antiquarians and urging them to fill in little reeking canals with the ruins from its leprous and crumbling palaces, all to be replaced with the imposing geometry of metal bridges and factories plumed with smoke. When they went back up for another speech in August, they provoked a terrible battle. The Passeists were beaten up. The futurist painters Boccioni, Russolo, and Carrà punctuated the speech with resounding slaps. The fists of Armando Mazza, a futurist poet who is also an athlete, left an unforgettable impression. Violence once again. Nobody understood its media appeal and power better than Marinetti. That's from an essay by Lawrence Rainey, the introduction to his book, Futurism in Anthology, which if you're interested in futurists, is an absolutely wonderful read. It's all of their manifestos, some of their art, and some essays about the work they did. So this is some of the work they were doing at the time. This is Umberto Boccioni, The Noise of the Street. I am not very good at analyzing paintings, nor do I know much about them, so it's hard for me to say much about this, other than the fact that we see the repeating themes of the futurists here, the themes that define their music, their literature, their paintings. We have the buildings of the cities rising up around the viewer. There is no sky or nature in this painting. The sky is just a little blue sliver at the top of the painting. The buildings of the city block all that out, with the workers and their tools being really the focus of it, and this sort of human figure seemingly at the bottom of the city, lying on their face down on the ground of the city. It's unclear what that is. That's Umberto Boccioni, though, and I've got another painting here to look at by him. This is Visioni. Oh, you guys can read it. And again, we see a similar theme. You've got the buildings rising up, all futurist themes here. I presented these two paintings by Boccioni for a reason. Boccioni is the man who tragically symbolizes futurist involvement with World War I, which I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. But the futurists idolized violence. They picked fistfights at their concerts, okay? So when World War I finally came around, and first of all, Marinetti was begging the government to enter into World War I, God knows why. When it rolled around, the futurists all signed up to go off to war. All these artists, they signed up. That's part of the reason why their production is suddenly halted there. And Boccioni was one of those who, a true believer in futurism, he signed up for war and glorified it. And, a month later, he's in a training exercise, he gets thrown from his horse, he gets trampled, and he's dead. So it's a tragic story. Boccioni gave his life for his belief in futurism, and a lot of people, when they look back on the futurist painting, they consider him the most talented one among them. So it's a shame that these are two of the only large paintings we have from Boccioni. I'm getting ahead of myself anyway. Before World War I, which came in 1914, we have all the Fantastic Futurist work of 1913, which is most of their musical output. Again, I come back to the idea which we mentioned earlier. The Futurists were not musicians, except for Balilla Pratella, who was trained by Mascagni. They were all writers primarily. There were 3 painters, and there was Pratella, who was a musician. Now, Luigi Russolo, who wrote The Art of Noises, one of the most significant tracks in the history of 20th century music, if not the most significant, he was a trained painter. Okay, but he was really an intellectual, a trained intellectual. His parents, he was somewhat wealthy. I don't know exactly how wealthy, not as wealthy as Marinetti, but his parents wanted him to do something worthwhile, and he just wanted to do art. He tried his hand at a bunch of different things, and he ended up in music. Well, actually, he ended up after that in mysticism as a sort of, early 20th century mystic. So, with them picking fistfights all over the country when they're trying to beat their ideas into people, this is the atmosphere into which The Art of Noise was written. Marinetti was trying to break Italian arts from the shackles of the past by literally beating it out of them. The musician Balilla Pratella had joined the movement in 1910, and although he produced 2 manifestos, neither had the impact of the one penned by the painter Russolo. Patella primarily argued for innovation in rhythm and a few other minor things, but he didn't argue for the wide sweeping changes that Russolo argued for in the art of noises. Russolo called for no less than the abolition of modern musical instruments and ensembles. He wanted to replace these with ensembles of noise-making machines. And so here we have some excerpts from The Art of Noises, which was on the reading list. I'm not going to go through all of these excerpts. First of all, musical art looked for the soft and limpid purity of sound. Then it amalgamated different sounds. Nowadays, musical art aims at the shrillest, strangest, and most dissonant amalgams of sound. Thus, we are approaching noise sound. So it's interesting, he calls this a revolution, but he says we're approaching this revolution. So he's trying to pull back on Marinetti's rhetoric, you can see. He's saying, music is getting more and more dissonant. And we should note, you might be thinking here, is he talking about Schoenberg? Schoenberg and the non-tonality, the 12-tone system of composition? No. That was not until the 1920s. Schoenberg didn't publish that until, what's the date, do you know? I think he really, after World War I was the 12-tone system. So that's not what he's talking about here. Really what he's talking about is the increase in dissonance from the late Romantic period, which we can see in guys like W.C., Gustav Holst, The Planets, who's the guy who wrote The Planets? Holst? I can't remember. And so you can see this rise in dissonance before World War I. So these are more excerpts from The Art of Noises. First of all, musical for the soft and limpid purity of sound. We already went over that. To excite our sensibilities, music has developed into a search for more complex polyphony and a greater variety of instrumental tones and coloring. It has tried to obtain the most complex succession of dissonant chords, thus preparing the ground for musical noise. The most complicated orchestra can be reduced to 4 or 5 categories of instruments with different sound code. He then lists them here. We must break at all costs from this restrictive circle of pure sounds and conquer the infinite variety of noise sounds. Let's walk together through a great modern capital with the ear more attentive than the eye, and we will vary the pleasures of our sensibilities by distinguishing among the gurglings of water, air and gas inside metallic pipes, the rumblings and rattlings of engines breathing with obvious animal spirits, the rising and falling of pistons, the stridency of mechanical saws, the loud jumping of trolleys on the rails, the snapping of whips, the whipping of flags. We will have fun imagining our orchestration of department stores, sliding doors, the hubbub of the crowds, the different roars of railroad stations, iron foundries, textile mills, printing houses, power plants, and subways. We must not forget the very new noises of modern warfare. Which he does not mean the video game there. But you can see that could have been penned yesterday. He's saying he wants a orchestra from a department store. I mean, we can hear that when we go outside today. We're not necessarily surrounded by the factories that he was surrounded by, but it's very forward-thinking. This entire essay is amazingly forward-thinking. I mean, he talks about stuff that we wouldn't see until at minimum 30 years later, and other stuff that we wouldn't see until 50 years later, and lots of ideas that we're still coming to terms with today. And one of the things he does here, and one of the most interesting things here, is he tries to get formal with it, which is intelligent, and it's really one of the first attempts at making a theory of sound art, at theorizing some sort of structure within which we can make art from general sound. Because before we can, notate out a music that can be performed by performers, or before we can make music in what we have computers today, we have to have a way of talking about it, of writing it down, of formalizing it in our heads. So he makes an attempt at doing this, and his attempt is weak, but you would expect that from the first attempt to do this. And I should make a caveat here. There probably were other attempts at this, but they weren't as well known as Russolo's, and they didn't have the influence that Russolo's attempt had. And I should make another caveat. We aren't totally sure that this was even written by Russolo. I mean, he's given credit, and we're going to say it was by Luigi Russolo. But Marinetti had his hand in everything the Futurists did. So you can even hear Marinetti's rhetoric and his style this essay and all of the Futurist essays. So you wonder if he was just editing or if he was doing more of the writing. I mean, you just don't know. So these are the 6 families of noises that he listed. 1, rumbles, thundering, explosions, crashes, slashes, booms. 2, whistles, hisses, snorts. 3, whispers, murmurs, mutters, buzzes, gurgles, scuffles, etc. He actually says etc. there. That's the only place he uses it. I'm not sure what we were supposed to extrapolate from that. 4, screeches, creaking, rustles, throbs, crackles. 5, noises made by percussion on metals, wood, skin, stone, terracotta. 6, voices of animals and people. I think today we can think of a lot more noises because we have been exposed to noise sound and noise music, sound poetry, all this stuff for 100 years. But also because we have synthesizers and we have all these ways of making music today, so that his list seems rather paltry. And of course he ended his essay, as all the Futurist manifestos did, with a series of pronouncements. And his series of pronouncements was just amazingly bold. And I'm going to reread some of these. Hopefully we can catch up some of the people who maybe didn't get to this reading yet. 1, Futurist musicians must constantly enlarge and enrich the field of sound. 2, Futurist musicians must replace the limited variety of timbres offered by contemporary orchestral instruments with the infinite variety of the timbres of noises reproduced by suitable mechanisms. 6, it will not be through a succession of noises imitating those of life, but through a fantastic combination of the various timbres and rhythms that the new orchestra will achieve the newest and most complicated aural emotions. For that purpose, every instrument will have to offer the possibility of varying its pitch, or will need a more or less extended range. So that's remarkable. What he describes there is a modern synthesizer. He says you have to create this instrument that creates these sounds, and we can vary its pitch. That technology, I mean, you can say that came about with tape music and the Musique Concrète of Pierre Schaeffer. We're going to see that in 30 years, right after World War II. But really, that didn't really come out about until we had digital music. And even today, that's still something we're struggling with. 7, the variety of noises is infinite. That's a pretty wise insight. So what he did is he created these instruments. Marinetti had a ton of money, as we know. Marinetti had money he inherited from his father, and he had money from his publishing business. His publishing business published a lot of Marinetti's own works and the manifestos of the Futurists, but they also published other works. So Marinetti was a rich guy, okay? And they had the money to bankroll a set of these sound makers, which they called intona rumori. In Italy, that means noise intoners. It's unclear exactly how Russollo's manifesto was received. While it was one of the most forward-thinking of the manifestos, Marinetti had published a lot of them by that point. Furthermore, the world could feel the encroaching war. But Russolo himself definitely believed in the philosophy he espoused. 3 months after the publication of his manifesto, he demonstrated the first of his intona rumori. These noise intoners were intended to become the orchestra of sounds envisioned by Russolo, but most of the music that was created with them was very modest. So this is our only picture of the intona rumori. Sadly, the intona rumori were destroyed in World War II. And we have some modern recreations of these, which I'm going to show kind of in the middle of this lecture. But it's a shame we lost these incredible artifacts, which created all sorts of sounds related to what he listed in his essay. Let's look at some of the music they created with them, which, as we said, was very modest. Not much actual music was created with the intona rumori, and what little was created barely followed Russolo's creed. Lilia Patella incorporated the intona rumori into a few of his orchestral works, but they were used more as sound effects, much like Beethoven used cannons in his Ode to Joy nearly 100 years prior. On April 21st, 1914, Luigi Russolo offered a concert of 9 musicians playing the intona rumori in Milan at the Teatro del Verme. Apparently, they played music for the intona rumori by Russolo and music for a mixed ensemble by Patella. Inevitably, Marinetti and the other Futurists started a fistfight in the middle of the concert. Russolo and Patella offered a handful of other concerts for the intona rumori, mostly in Italy, but with occasional excursions to other parts of Italy. I don't know if this last one is true. Have you seen a Russolo score, Zach? I think there might be one excellent score, but it's impossible to find online. Balia Patella's scores have survived, but again, Patella's scores, he really just uses the intono rumori as sound effects. So it's not really the forward-thinking stuff that Russolo's work was, which used the sound effects as the meat of the music, okay? The sound effects were the centerpiece. But mostly what they did, they only held 6 concerts total, you see that? 6 concerts total. I think it was 4 in Italy, 1 in Paris, and 1 in London. So not many people heard these. More people heard them through private demonstrations. They would take these instruments to people's salons and people's living rooms and demonstrate them for wealthy or famous people of the day, such as Igor Stravinsky and others. We'll see Igor Stravinsky's account of them later. But they were not widely used. They were destroyed in World War II. So again, I'm going to come back to this idea which I stated earlier. Futurists were not really musicians. They were writers, they were painters, and they've had a profound impact on music, but primarily through their thoughts and their writings, through their advocating a new kind of music that incorporated noise and sounds. These are ideas, once again, that we're still coming to terms with today. Okay, so this is kind of the end of the Futurist part. We're going to talk about Dada in a minute, but I wanted to show you guys a little bit of the modern recreations of Futurist instruments. Not necessarily as interesting as the other ones, where the focus was more on the instruments. And I'll just leave you with the statement that the Futurists and the Dadaists created artistic and theoretic bases that flowered into 20th century electroacoustic music. So, that's that. Thank you.